All right. Record. No, it's going. Okay. All right. Welcome, you guys. Thank you all for coming back. It's been a long and interesting week. Happy Thursday to you too. I wanted to start real quick. I gave everybody an assignment last week to, if you wanted to take it, you could. And that was to pick something that you thought was worth studying or worth looking up or finding more out about that we talked about last week, and doing a little bit of research. So I'm wondering if any of you did that and if you'd share with us what you studied and what you learned. Let's see. Beth, can I pick on you?
Sure, you can pick on me. So I didn't like full on go out and study and research, but I've my thing lately is I've been following a lot of different sources like on Instagram and Facebook and different people, and so I've used them kind of because I've so I know I shared one with you like last week, a whole thread about history that went along with this, and so I've just been reading through a lot of those and learning so much, so a few related to what we learned last week, the follow up, like the Black Codes. I know you shared something else today on Facebook about that, and different things. And man, there's just so much, honestly. And then I've also been not related to anything you said directly last week, but tomorrow, Juneteenth, it's in the time period that that's about what you were talking about last week. So I've been studying about that, and I have a book to read with my kids tomorrow and stuff. So I've been in tears a lot this week, honestly, because of so many different things I've seen, like with the Black Codes, and how much, like one of them, the apprenticeship of the kids. That basically, if a Black parent didn't have a job, they were a vagrant, so their kids couldn't be taken, and they could be taken till 21 if they were boys and 18 if they were girls, and just and the employer, not really employer, but they could discipline the child however they wanted. So essentially, those kids were not free ever from slavery, and those parents weren't, and the whole system of the Black Codes and the peonage and everything it was just ridiculous. And it was just, it was so upsetting to figure out like how much slavery was not gone, that it was just for so long put into that system and just renamed. So
Thank you for that. And I want you guys to do the same this week. There's no expectation as to how much study you would do or anything, but the things that we're talking about, I promise you, will be more meaningful for you in your life if you take the opportunity to, the assignment was to pick something that we talked about that spoke to you, study a bit about it, and then teach it to someone else, share it with someone else. And I do believe that will enhance your experience here. And Beth kind of alluded to feeling, she spoke clearly about feeling upset this week and being in tears at different times. And I thought really long and hard about what I wanted to teach this week. And I spent all day preparing. And the way that I prepare is not to go and read books or anything. I studied history in college, and I took a lot of classes in college and before then, and I've done a lot of teaching of students. I taught U.S. history several times, and I like to experience history firsthand. So, for example, a couple of years ago, I took a trip to Missouri, and I was able to travel around almost the whole 4 sides of the state. And I just studied I just stopped and learned about history as I went. And they have the National World War I Museum is in Kansas City. The National Historical Site for Dr. George Washington Carver, who is one of my, I would say, truly one of my heroes, is there. I drove across the border into Kansas, and I went to the Brown versus Board of Education Historical Site, National Historical Site. I stopped at Mark Twain's house. I went to this town called Lawrence, Kansas, where once upon a time it was an experiment for free blacks to be able to live there and marry and have jobs. And because there was a lot of anger about some back and forth things that had happened before the Civil War started, the white raiders rode into Lawrence, Kansas, and murdered everyone that they came across as they made their way through the town. And so I went there, and I went to the site of where they wrote where they had their constitutional convention, when Kansas was a deciding vote in whether or not it would tip the scales of free states versus slave states. And it was really interesting, that trip. But that's the way that I study history. So I'm not sitting around necessarily reading. I actually have several books that I brought back from that trip that I still haven't finished yet. But so that is to say that I have a resource list at the end of this slide for you guys today, and a lot of them are websites. There's a few books that are referenced, but a lot of websites that you can go to and I think are pretty reputable and will help you. I do want to say thank you all for coming. We have people from Alaska and New Jersey and Utah and all around here in Washington. So I'm grateful that you guys have all come. I do want to say to you today that I thought really hard about what I wanted to teach, and I'm just going to give you a trigger warning because I want to share with you some really, really hard things today. And as I was studying them myself, I found myself growing cold and just crying uncontrollably almost, because these are some really hard things. So that's the name of the lesson today. It says, I don't want to harrow up your souls. So in college, I took a class called History of the South, and the professor was from the South, and she would tell us things, and she always said, I don't want to harrow up your souls. And then she would tell us these things that were important for us to know, and they have always stuck with me. So today we're going to talk about what happened after Reconstruction. We're going to talk about the advent of Jim Crow laws and segregation in America. We're going to talk about lynching and race riots that occurred. And you guys are going to see so many correlations. And don't forget what we talked about last week, in that when we study history, we look at it through the eyes of them that were experiencing it. We're kind of outsiders just watching, and then we learn from it. And the things that we talk about today, if you don't see the need for us to learn from them, then you are not getting it. But I think you guys are getting it. So please know that I warned you, and if you need another warning before I'm going to say something, then tell me. But I think we'll be okay. All right, so we're going to go quickly over the timeline, and then I'm going to break down each of these for you. So after the Civil War, or after Reconstruction, we kind of alluded to this last week, a system was installed in America called sharecropping. So by the early 1870s, the system known as sharecropping had come to dominate agriculture across the cotton planting South. And Amy, I want to acknowledge your comment. The struggle that you realized was how little I truly understood and knew. And I think that's an important realization to come to. Starting from 1877 up until the 1960s, there was an institution, a way of dealing with things called lynching in America. And lynching is an act of terror meant to spread fear among blacks, served the broad social purpose of maintaining white supremacy in the in the economic, social, and political spheres. So that has a huge breadth of time, and we'll talk some more in detail about that. Again, the same time period, 1877 to the 1960s, was a time period where Jim Crow laws were the law of the land, especially in the South. They were a collection of state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation. An important event in 1881 was the establishment of a school called Tuskegee Normal Institute. It was founded by Booker T. Washington as a trade school for former slaves. And then on May 18th, 1896, there was a ruling given by the Supreme Court known as Plessy versus Ferguson. And this ruling stated that separate was constitutional as long as it was equal. In 1909, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was founded. And then moving on, a really important thing that happened was the advent of World War I. World War I occurred from July 1st, 1914 to November 11th, 1918. We've heard a lot about this time period right now because this is also the time period of the Spanish influenza, which is a pandemic, worldwide pandemic that we kind of know a little something about. The U.S. joined the war on April 6, 1917. And before then, in December of 1915, is known as the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan, so the second incarnation, organized in Georgia by a man named Colonel William Joseph Simmons. This is often called the second Ku Klux Klan. Another event that affected strongly what happened in Black America was the Great Black Migration, which started in 1916 and went through 1930. And these happened in waves. So the nation's largest movement, it was the largest movement of African Americans from the rural South to cities located in the North. And I want to talk to you about some specific events, things that you might not have even heard about. And so from July 1st to July 3rd, 1917 was something known as the East St. Louis Race Riot. Amy, tell that man to put a shirt on. A small Illinois city located across the river from its Missouri counterpart was overrun with violence. And then later that month, on July 28th, 1917, was a demonstration known as the Silent Parade. And this happened in Harlem in New York City. And 10,000 African American children, women, and men marched in silence in response to the East St. Louis Race Riot. And then on the summer of 1919, so 2 years later, was took place what was called the Chicago Riot, and it was better known as the Red Summer. It lasted 13 days, claimed 38 lives, 537 people were injured, and 1,000 people were made homeless. And the summer of 1919 began the greatest period of interracial strife in U.S. history at that time, including a wave of disturbing race riots. And I'm going to talk about all these more in detail. Okay, so any questions or thoughts before we move on and I start telling you about these individual things? Okay, so I'm going to close that. Hopefully I can see if anybody else comes in. Okay, so after the Reconstruction was over, there started to be some really strong voices in Black America, and they were shaping the narrative and really starting to help determine the direction that Black America will go in. And one of these people who had a very strong and loud voice was a man named Booker T. Washington. And Booker T. Washington was born into slavery, but he was born in 1872, or no, excuse me, he was born in 1856, so a few years before the Civil War was over. And Booker T. Washington was super influential, and he had his detractors, and we'll talk about one of them in a moment. But he believed in education, but he mostly felt that African Americans should learn to put it very plainly. He felt like they should learn a trade, and so one of the first things that he did in his life was get an education of his own. So he attended this school called the Wayward Seminary, and he was like 500 miles away from where he lived, and he walked there. And he got there, and he'd spent all his money, you know, everything he had getting there. So he had to prove himself, and they let him stay, and he gained an education there. And so he was well-read, he was well-spoken, he was very funny, they said. He had a great sense of humor. And he, as a result of being at the Wayward Seminary, was given the opportunity to be a principal of a new school in Alabama called the, I don't know if it was called this at the time, eventually became the Tuskegee Normal Industrial Institute. So he went down there to start this school, and he was kind of misled because there wasn't really a school there. It was like a collection of beat down buildings and students that wanted to go to school. So he believed, it says here, he believed education was a cornerstone for the advancement of Blacks, and his efforts to raise money for his institute helped secure its well-deserved reputation as a leading educational institution for African Americans. So one of the things that's famous about Booker T. Washington is the way that he interacted with white America. And in 1895, there was a World's Fair in Atlanta, and he was asked to speak, and he gave this famous speech called the Atlanta Compromise speech. Let's turn here. And these are some of the things, these are just a couple quotes from the speech that he gave. And he was talking to white people, and he said, cast it down in agriculture, mechanics, in commerce, in domestic service, and in the professions. And in this connection, it is well to bear in mind that whatever other sins the South may be called to bear, when it comes to business, pure and simple, it is in the South that the Negro is given a man's chance in the commercial world, and in nothing is this exposition more eloquent than in emphasizing this chance. Our greatest danger is that in the great leap from slavery to freedom, we may overlook the fact that the masses of us are to live by the productions of our hands, and fail to keep in mind that we shall prosper in proportion as we learn to dignify and glorify common labor, and put brains and skills into the common occupations of life, shall prosper in proportion as we learn to draw the line between the superficial and the substantial, the ornamental gewgaws of life and the useful. No race can prosper till it learns that there is as much dignity in tilling a field as in writing a poem. It is at the bottom of life we must begin, and not at the top, nor should we permit our grievances to overshadow our opportunities. So basically, he felt like that African Americans would prosper in this country if they learned how to work hard and they learned a trade. So the institute that he formed was a trade school. They focused specifically a lot on brick making, learning how to be builders. And so he told the people at this convention that he was at, this famous line here on the other side of the board here. He says, as we have proved our loyalty to you in the past in nursing your children, watching by the sickbed of your mothers and fathers, and often following them with tear-dimmed eyes to their graves, so in the future, in our humble way, we shall stand by you with a devotion that no foreigner can approach, ready to lay down our lives, if need be, in defense of yours, interlacing our industrial, commercial, civil, and religious life with yours in a way that shall make the interests of both races one. In all things that are purely social, we can be separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. So basically, he was telling them that we can be separate like the fingers of the hand, but we can also be helpful to you and connected to you by learning trades and doing the work that you need done. And so he set about that, and he was very successful at it. He said the words that a lot of people wanted to hear, and he paid a price for that, because in the Black community, while he was well followed and he did great work, there were some that said he was kind of a bit of a sellout, I guess you could say. So even to this day, I just had this conversation on Facebook with another friend of mine who is Team Washington, and the other guy that was kind of on the other side of this is a man named W.E.B. Du Bois. That's how he said his name. He said that's how he said it. But let me go back real quickly just to, if you, just a little note that in 1996, Booker T. Washington hired Dr. George Washington Carver as a teacher at the Tuskegee Institute, which he was a teacher of science there, and he stayed there all the rest of his life. And if you want to study an amazing, inspiring man with your children, then I suggest you study Dr. George Washington Carver. He is, to me, one of the most humble, intelligent, devoted, spiritual people I've ever read about, and he is well worth your time in learning about him. So W.E.B. Du Bois was kind of along the same lines as Washington. He also had a voice. He was very educated. He attended Fisk University. If you remember last week, we talked about some of the schools that were founded by the Freedmen's Bureau, and Fisk was one of those. And then in 1888, he was accepted to Harvard University and became the first African American to receive a doctorate from Harvard. Du Bois wrote lots of things. One of the things that he wrote was this book called The Souls of Black Folk. He wrote it in 1903, and it's just a series of essays that he wrote about topics that had to do with race. And there's a chapter in there that's specifically devoted to his feelings about Booker T. Washington. But in 1905, Du Bois founded what was called the Niagara Movement. And this was a small group of people that wanted to form an organization to work towards racial equality. And they had a list of things that they wanted to accomplish. And the Niagara Movement was founded on the Canadian side of the Niagara Falls, because that's the only place that they could easily sit together and work together. But not long after that, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was founded in 1909, and it kind of took over the work that the Niagara Movement was hoping to embark on. And the NAACP was founded by a group of white people, but they hired Du Bois as their director of publicity and research. And he was the only Black person on that initial leadership team. So, and from then on till almost, I think, for the rest of his life, he was the editor in chief for their publication called The Crisis. He helped start it, and then he wrote, was in charge of it for all these years. He was an outspoken critic of Washington, because, well, I'll tell you in his own words. So in The Souls of Black Folk, his essay entitled Of Mr. Booker T. Washington and Others, he said, and so thoroughly did he learn the speech and thought of triumphant commercialism, the he being Booker T. Washington, and the ideals of material prosperity, that the picture of a lone Black boy poring over a French grammar amid the weeds and dirt of a neglected home soon seemed to him the acme of absurdities. One wonders what Socrates and St. Francis of Assisi would say to this. So I want to kind of paint a picture to you, because I think inside of me, I feel like both arguments were so powerful and so important. To learn a trade and to make yourself useful. One of the things Washington did was really help the former slaves avoid the pitfalls of the government being involved in supporting them and taking care of them. So like that welfare state. He said, you should work for yourself. But the work that they were doing and the efforts they were doing was to stay out of the way of the white people to make themselves useful but stay separate. And Du Bois wanted very much for that integration to start taking place. And he also so thoroughly believed in the education of his people. So in the second quote, it says, "In answer to this, it has been claimed that the Negro can only survive through submission. Mr. Washington distinctly asks that Black people give up, at least for the present, three things. First, political power. Second, insistence on civil rights. And third, higher education of Negro youth, and concentrate all their energies on industrial education, the accumulation of wealth, and the conciliation of the South." So they never did see eye to eye. But I think it's important to understand in the Black community specifically that these were some of the main ideas that were out there, and were helping shape the direction that these former slaves were going in. So this was after Reconstruction, in those 30 years before the turn of the century, that these two were working so hard to get their ideas out there. You guys can type any questions at any time, or ask me any questions you like. I can't promise that I will be able to answer them all, but I will tell you answers next week or next time. So last time we kind of talked about how sharecropping became a big the replacement for slavery. So all of these millions of freed slaves still needed to be able to take care of themselves. And so when the government receded from the South, left them to it, then the thing they knew how to do was work the land. And so they set up, they were able to do that under the heading of sharecropping. So a sharecropper was someone who rented land from the landowner, and the main thing they did was they would raise cash crops, so crops that they could easily sell. And in order to be able to work the land, they had to have all the equipment to do so: seed, fertilizer, food, etc. And so the landowner would allow them to lease that equipment from them on credit, so they didn't pay for it until their crops came in. But the thing that they did was they had a very high interest on everything that the sharecropper would borrow. And this sharecropping, if you see here in the bullet points here, was not only Blacks that were relegated to sharecropping. 2/3 of sharecroppers were white, and 1/3 of them were Blacks. And so this was kind of an equalizer in the poverty and the bad experiences they had with sharecropping. And they had unscrupulous owners, as we can only guess, and they would end up with crippling debt. They were called sharecroppers or tenant farmers, and they would find themselves hopelessly indebted to landowners due to bad crop years. So there were things like the boll weevil infestations that happened at this time, floods, there were low crop prices, and the limited opportunities of not being able to own their own land. And one of the things that these landowners would do, which was a common practice, was to make it so that they couldn't sell their crops to anyone else but them. So even if they could get a higher price elsewhere, they were required to only sell their crops to their landlords. And so sharecropping was the law of the land for a long time, all the way through the Great Depression. And if you know about, we'll probably get to this later, but what made the Great Depression so much worse was the hardships of being able to farm. And in places like the Midwest, in Kansas, in Oklahoma, which became the Dust Bowl, and so farming was not viable and very difficult. So when the Depression was over and into the 1940s was when sharecropping started to fade away. But sharecropping and being the stereotype of being a poor Black or white farmer, tenant farmer, working this land so hard with your skinny donkey and your hoe and all that. So that's an enduring stereotype that sticks in our brains because of this time period. Okay, so I talked to you last time about black codes and how the black codes were written to kind of help to manage all of these slaves. And if any of you guys read any of the articles that I posted this week or that were shared, it spoke some interesting things about the black codes in this institution known as peonage. So the amendment, it said that 13th Amendment said that slavery was outlawed, was illegal, except in the instances of being arrested, being imprisoned. And so these people in the South, they're very shrewd. They thought they were quick thinking. And so they're like, oh, I can arrest them and put them in slavery again. And so that's what Beth was talking about the indentured servitude and the laws that were against vagrancy and doing anything but working in the only way that they allowed you to work. So those laws made it very hard, and those laws evolved into what were called the Jim Crow laws. And along with Jim Crow laws became something known as Jim Crow etiquette. So I will tell you a little bit about the general thought process as we move into the new century. This was a leftover from slavery and why we even justified it. You could find all sorts of people at the time who would espouse these thoughts: ministers, theologians. There were craniologists who would come and study your shape of your head and what it could tell you about you. Eugenicists. So eugenicists were people that were about thinning out the population, and they would advocate that you shouldn't allow Black people to even reproduce because their offspring they weren't helpful to society, I guess you could say. There were these people felt and more that Blacks were innately and intellectually and culturally inferior to whites. So this is where the term of calling someone a coon or a darky, or the time of really starting to use the word nigger, because you were talking about people that they didn't think were intellectually, culturally, or so socially, they didn't have it in them to be equals. So it was also the time of the reinforcement of anti-Black stereotypes. So there were these minstrel shows, and that's where Jim Crow was. He was a minstrel character they would go around on the vaudeville stages, which was the theater, and they would perform these shows, these minstrel shows, and they would show that Blacks were lazy, that they were oversexed, that they were stupid and ignorant. And so that was the entertainment of the time. They thought that Blacks were a mongrel race, and they didn't want them to be interacting with the white race at all. So one of the biggest worries of a Southern person, man or woman, was that there would be sexual relations amongst Blacks and whites, and the women were to be upheld, their virtue was to be upheld, and so that was a big reason why lynching would occur, or an excuse, they would say, because a white woman had been disgraced somehow. Interracial unions were completely discouraged. And so this turned into an etiquette, a way of being. And for African Americans in the South, it was a means of survival to understand Jim Crow etiquette. And these were laws that were on the books. We We're trying right now, little by little. We're in just even the last couple of weeks. There's been a big discussion this week about Quaker Oats getting rid of this Aunt Jemima and not having her be their syrup spokesperson anymore. She's the stereotype of Aunt Jemima is a holdover from Jim Crow times, from the happy mammy who would take care of the white children at the expense of her own, and she was only happy if she was caring for others. Beth, you want to tell us what you wrote here?
Yeah, so a couple things that just occurred to me as you were reading through these and as I was kind of looking at your notes, that one thing that I found yesterday was at state fairs between like the 1880s up until the 1950s and other like where people gathered for entertainment and where they had kind of like carnival type games. There was a game called the African Dodger, and I saw a few like short video clips from movies from like the 1930s, early black and white films that had this. And essentially it was it was the little carnival booth, and they gave you 3 baseballs for a dime, or some was a dime, some was a nickel, but you got 3 baseballs, not softballs, not something small, hard baseballs. And a black man or a young adult stuck his head through a hole in the back of the curtain, and people threw the baseballs at them. And so many were, obviously brain damage and things from this. Trigger warning, there was another version of the game that involved babies and toddlers. And I couldn't, I literally had to stop reading. So, many of you don't know me, but my husband is mixed. I have 4 small children, including a toddler, that are mixed race, and that, they would have been subjected to some of these, laws, and I couldn't believe how inhumane, how other human beings were treated as objects and as such inferior things that they didn't have rights to even. I can't make my clear thoughts right now, but and just like as something that in 2020 that we still have doctors, medical students who believe that blacks are different than whites genetically. They can feel less pain, so we shouldn't give them as much pain medicine during surgery or procedures, that their skin is thicker so they can do. People believe this today. Recent studies and surveys of medical students, they still believe this. This is still something that's going on. And so why should we, give them, more things? This is, why we still have black women dying in childbirth more than any, most countries. We have a huge, I don't know. It's just really like these things have lasted so long and done so much damage that it's still just mind-boggling.
So anytime you hear an understanding that someone might have about what quote-unquote blacks are like, when it's a negative stereotype, you can often say that this is a holdover or a vestige of this time period. The idea that they're lazy, the idea that they don't want to work, the idea that they're anything different than us, than other races as humans, is a holdover, and this was very, very deeply rooted in our country. Thank you, Beth, for sharing that. So Jim Crow laws were made the law of the land because of two cases. There was a a case in Louisiana in 1890 where somebody, they made a law. It's called the separate car law. And it said, as long as it's equal, they could be separate. So the people, the leaders the black leaders in Louisiana wanted to test this law. They wanted to fight it. So they asked a man named Homer A. Plessy, and this is Homer right here. And I didn't realize this, but Homer was picked because he was 7/8 white and 1/8 black. So Homer was the same amount of black as I am. And he wanted, so he went and sat in the wrong car in the train, and he was arrested. And then they were able to take, we know the process. They was able to take the case to all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in a 7-1 ruling, the Supreme Court upheld that separate could be equal. And so this is the wording, part of the wording from the case. So it says, we consider the underlying fallacy of the plaintiff's argument to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation of two races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority. If this be so, it is not by reason of anything found in the act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construct upon it. So you're saying they're choosing to be offended by this. The argument also assumes that social prejudice may be overcome by legislation, and that equal rights cannot be secured except by an enforced commingling of the two races. So they're saying, you're asking us to make you guys like each other by laws. That can't happen. If the civil and political rights of both races be equal, one cannot be inferior to the other civilly or politically. So it's like, if they get equal treatment, then that's all you can hope for. If one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them upon the same plane. So they're saying we cannot legislate your social interactions, and we refuse to do so. So as long as it's equal, separate is okay. So from 1896 on, the phrase separate but equal was the law of the land. And then we talked about this last week. Then it was particularly egregious when it came to voting rights. And so they were able to, that's not what I wanted to say about that. I was talking about court cases in general. So then another thing that happened that created extra inequality was things like grandfather clauses and poll taxes and white primaries and literacy tests, all of which had to be dismantled individually. In 1915, in a case called Gwynn versus the United States, they ruled that the grandfather clause only was unconstitutional. So they had to take them down, dismantle them one by one. But separate but equal became the law of the land. And I think we all know, when we talk about that, we know some of the things that were segregated in America. But I made you a list here so that we could, and I'm sure I'm still missing things, but I wanted to just kind of help you to see the depth and breadth of what segregation in America was. So water fountains, doors, door entrances and door exits, public facilities such as beaches, hospitals that included mental hospitals, blind wards, nurses and who they could nurse, prisons, schools, regular schools and reform schools. And it also dictated who you could teach if you were a teacher. Churches, cemeteries and burials, restrooms, any type of public accommodation, boating. Whites and blacks were not allowed to go boating together. Parks. Black and white people could not sit in a park together and play checkers or dominoes. It was not allowed. And these would all be laws on the books in different states and cities and around in the South. So there might not necessarily be uniform, but they were all laws on the books. Going to the barbers, So if you know anything about Black culture, the barbershop in Black culture is a super important element of their upbringing. And it stems from the development of the Black barbershop from segregation. Buses, child custody. You were not allowed, if you were, you would not have a white child ever placed in the custody of a Black person. Libraries, the militia, the serving and purchasing of wine and beer, and then marriage and sexual relations. And this is just the some of them. There's a long standing kind of a joke, but also a reality, is that a lot of Black people don't like the water. They don't go swimming. They don't know how to swim. There's a lot of Black people who just don't know how to swim. And that stems from the fact that their parents didn't know how to swim, and back so on and so forth, because they were never allowed to go to the public pools. And so they never had the opportunity as children, which is something you take for granted. When I was a kid, the summer was all about swimming. That's all we did. We'd go take our swimming lessons and we'd go swim at the park. And that was not something that was available to Black youth in the 20th century. So Black people today, a lot of them still don't know how to swim. It's just not part of their culture. It never became part of their culture. There's a famous African-American tennis player named Arthur Ashe. He passed away a while ago from, he got AIDS from a transplant, but he was a tennis player, and he was like one of the only Black tennis players ever. And he talks in his book about the discrimination he experienced from trying to figure out how to be able to learn to play tennis. Let's see. Beth says she went on a private tour of the Pentagon once with a friend who worked there, and she pointed out the excess amount of staircases and restrooms, which were a remnant of segregation. Yeah, if you've ever watched the movie Hidden Figures, they explain that really in depth there, that they weren't allowed to use the bathroom that was closest to them, and they had to be back to work at a certain time, so they'd always be racing back and forth to go to the bathroom. So you can see how this would be wearing and would get old really fast. I interviewed my grandmother once, and we talked about her trip to school every day and how she had to take a bus and a trolley and walk a mile before she could get to the segregated school. And she said how the stairs were all bowed in the building because it was so old and rickety, and how they only had the hand-me-down books from the white school. They were all written in and missing their covers. And there's one thing I feel personally that I've always felt a lot of pride in, and a lot of take a lot of hope from, is that education, no matter how they could get it, at this time especially, was very important to the African American community, and they persevered really strongly in making sure that they could still, they could get education any way that they could. All right, so now we're gonna talk about lynching. So lynching is the practice of, it was, I think I have let me see. No, thought I had written down a definition here. We think of it as people being hung, but it was more than that. It was institutionalized murder in our country for a long time. So from 1877 to 1950, over 4,000 African Americans were lynched across 20 states. I said African Americans, that's not true. I should have clarified that. People were lynched across 20 states. So a lot of white people were lynched during this time period, and they would have been, a lot of them were either people who had gone down to help with the civil rights movement, which was a very dangerous pursuit in the 60s. And then out west, we know that like cattle rustlers, people who stole cattle or were outlaws, they could be lynched. And so the 3,446 of these were black, and the top 3 states were Mississippi, Georgia, and Texas. They also included some western states. So if you're looking at the white numbers, you're often looking at people who were being lynched out west. So I wanted to show you this site, and I want to encourage you guys to take some time to explore this site. It's in the sources page. It's put out by the Equal Justice Initiative. If you have been able to watch the movie Just Mercy, it shows the building up of this organization. And this is a really great site that you can go to with your kids and study about lynching in America. So this is an introduction to it, and then it has all of these sections that you can go to. And this watch one, we won't do it, we won't have time, but there's some really impacting videos in there. These are all the videos, and I watched this one, let's see, this one right here, and it's the story of this family, and the girl in the green, her great-grandfather was lynched, and then their family moved to California, and they hadn't been back to the South, and then they traveled back and did some genealogy and went to the site of the tree where he was lynched and learned all about what happened, and kind of tried to heal a bit from when their father and grandfather was lynched in 1912. And then there's some lesson plans in here, and this is a map that shows you the density of lynchings in the South and where these occurred. And so you can see, like, they were elsewhere, but clearly the majority took place in the American South. I don't think that I could do justice to the terror that people lived under when it came to this practice of lynching. Lynchings were often community events. They would be covered in local newspapers. Many of the victims were Black businessmen or Black men who refused to back down. And so at a certain point in time, there was an estimated 2 to 3 a week in the South, and they were often carried out by the police. And this led to a situation that was really hard for families, because the people that were often being lynched were Black men, and they were often young Black men. So they would be a family's teenage or like 20-something age children. And as you can imagine, being forced to live by an indiscriminate set of laws, rules, and etiquette, where you could do this, but you couldn't do this, and you could do this, but you couldn't do this, and half the time you didn't even know that you had done something, and then always living in fear that one night there would be headlights across your front window, and your child would be pulled out of your home, and you would never see them again. And so this was a huge fear that many African-American, well, all the African-American families lived under. And the mothers would work really hard to either help their children to not be frustrated, and explain to them how they needed to not get upset and why, or they would encourage them to just leave and go and move. And we'll talk about that in a second. But one of the things that I really want you to understand is that lynching was not being hung. Lynching was being brutally murdered. And I looked up, I wanted to find an instance that I could share with you. And the one that I read just made me go cold. I'd never read anything like this. And I will tell you about it, but it's very upsetting. This woman refused to tell them where her husband was. And so they caught her, and they hung her by her ankles. The group hung her by her ankles over a bridge. And were torturing her there, and she was pregnant, and they slit open her belly and then had her baby come out, and they killed her baby on that bridge and made her watch, and then they killed her. And those were common occurrences. This was something that did not faze people for some reason, that their willingness to take these people's lives was in large part rooted in what I spoke about last week, which was this idea that they would be overrun and that they would be they would lose the control that they had had for so long. And so they were, by any means possible, working as hard as they could to keep their upper hand over African Americans in the South. So don't ever let anyone tell you that lynching was just the practice of being hung. This was one story, but we could break our hearts here if we wanted to talk about more. It was extremely brutal. And a lot of the people that were carrying these out were members of the Ku Klux Klan. And if you remember, I told you last week that the Ku Klux Klan had been eradicated, but this, what was known as the Second Klan, was organized in Georgia in December of 1915 by a man named William J. Simmons. And by 1920, this organization of the Klan had expanded to 5 million members, and said that they had also expanded who they hated. So they were anti-Catholic and anti-Jew and anti-Black by this time. And they were also moving north to respond to the migration of Southern Blacks to the northern cities. And they were spurred on by this film called The Birth of a Nation by a man named D.W. Griffith. It was really fascinating because they said this is his interpretation of the Civil War and Reconstruction. And it was this epic 3-hour movie that he'd made. It was a silent film. And there's a huge, really weird dichotomy in this movie because it was the best film that had been made up to that point. So the production value was huge. And it made tons of money. It was very popular. And it portrayed the Klan as the heroes. And it was actually screened at the White House by President Wilson. And it helped with this huge resurgence of the Klan. In fact, United Artists is a filmmaking company today which was founded by this guy, D.W. Griffith. He was like an amazing filmmaker, but his greatest work was this film called Birth of a Nation, which was an homage to the Klan in the South and did lots of damage. It's 8 o'clock now, so I would like to finish. So if you want to stick around, you can. And if you have to go, I would understand that. And I will post the recording. And I will do this again next month. I'll do 2 weeks in a row. I won't be able to do it until probably the second and third weeks of July. So, but I talked to you a little bit about the migration. So there was actually a really huge migration of Blacks in the South. They were wanting to get out of the harsh indignities of life. They wanted more freedom, more equality. They'd heard about better jobs. This was still the Industrial Revolution, and there was a world war going on. So a lot of men were not there to work these industrial jobs. And so companies were giving out reduced fare tickets. There was some special accommodation. They thought there would be educational opportunities. So Blacks were streaming out of the South. If you've ever wondered how come there's a lot of African Americans in New York and Detroit and Chicago in St. Louis, and then over in California on the West Coast. All of that comes from this time period, and it was a long time up until I had it here earlier. Let me go back and I'll tell you the date real quick. Let's see. Great Migration from 1916 to 1930. It all stemmed from this time period of needing to leave. In fact, it says, all in all, this mass demographic shift was 1/10 of the country's Black population left the South. So Chicago experienced in the 1910s 148% increase in their population. New York was a 66% increase. Philadelphia had I don't understand how it works when it's more than 100%, but Philadelphia had a 500% increase in their population. Detroit had a 611% increase. So what we're seeing is they were leaving. And this is a little bit early for my grandfather, but he was born in Mississippi, and then he moved to St. Louis for work in probably the late 20s, maybe the 30s, and then moved out to Washington. So this is why they don't have a lot of Blacks that live in the center of the United States. It wasn't because Wyoming is so not Black friendly. It just was about where were the jobs. And so, let's see. As often happens with immigration and emigration, there's a difference here. The promise was not as good, or the reality was not as good as the promise. So they had halted immigration because of the war. So there were jobs available, but the jobs were cooks, janitors, porters. So being a porter on the railway was a really popular job for African Americans. My grandmother, after my grandpa died, she had this boyfriend forever, and he was a porter, and he would go back and forth from, I think he lived in Chicago and would come out here back and forth, and he worked his whole life as a porter on the train. And women could get jobs as cleaners, servants, and domestics. My grandmother was a domestic in a family. Oh, and she's always joked about it, she wasn't even that good. She didn't know how to cook very well or anything, but she worked as a maid in the home. And this brought on the rise of ghettos and the problems that come with urban life. So there was also things that happened at that time. There was a lot of discrimination in housing. So in 1917, the Supreme Court declared that racially biased housing ordinances were unconstitutional. And some residents would get around that by enacting covenants that required white property owners to agree not to sell to Blacks. And some of those would be legal until they were struck down in the late 1940s. I found it really interesting as I've been watching the realizations that people are having recently about the depth of racial, I think those increases that Beth, I had asked myself that same question, and it was the population in total. But where people are starting to realize the depth of prejudice in our countries, and one of them that's been really vocal is a friend of mine who's a real estate agent, and she has been posting a lot and doing a lot of work to help herself and her other real estate friends realize that industry has been really biased and prejudiced for a long time. And so that's where we know we could talk forever about all the different enclaves and all the different areas that have holdovers from this time period that we're talking about and that are still experiencing racial issues today. Okay, so here's a picture of a whole family that was packing up and moving to Chicago. So with the move to Chicago, or to the cities, there was more racial unrest. And so this is a picture, it's a Google Doodle from 2017. It was the 100-year anniversary of what was called the Silent March. And this was a march. It was the first mass demonstration against racial violence. And I kind of told you about that earlier in the timeline. 10,000 men, women, and children marched silently through the streets to protest against what had happened in the East St. Louis, Illinois. Oh, let's see, I'm going to come back to that. Let's see, did I not? Okay. So in earlier that month, in the it was July of 1917, there was a race riot in East St. Louis, and it went on from July 1st through the 3rd, so 3 days. And trying to remember, I have a website that you guys can read about it in the sources, but I'm going to pull it up because I want to tell you this correctly. So this is the other thing that I wanted to share with you guys today that I thought would be rather upsetting. So let me just stop sharing this with you, and I will just paraphrase for you a little bit. So the East St. Louis is a little small city across the Mississippi River from St. Louis proper. And there was a labor dispute. And so a lot of white workers had walked off the job, and these factories needed workers, so they called in a lot of black workers. And that really upset a lot of white people. And says by the end of those 3 days, there were 39 black individuals and 9 whites who were dead. But they said they believed really that the death toll was probably closer to 100 that were killed. The numbers were never very clear. And it says, let's see, I wanted to see why it started. Let's see. There's one thing. Oh, there was word of an attempted robbery of a white man by an armed black man. And so as a result of that, for 3 days, there was rampant killing of any black person that was found in the city. And they were just going around and murdering them with guns and rocks and pipes. They were burning down their houses. They were lynching them in other areas of the city. This is happening in the downtown. And people were trying to escape by swimming across the river, and they were playing sport with them by standing on the shores and shooting them. And they were tried to cross a bridge, and they closed the bridge on either side and killed everyone on the bridge. Talked about how there was a big, heavy man that came out of a burning building and was met by a group of armed white people, and they tried to get him, and they clubbed him and struck him in the face, and they pushed a iron bolt, I don't know how they did it, between his eyes, and then they battered him with rocks. And then a little girl came up and kicked him and was disgusted because she got blood on her shoe. They talked about a woman, a little girl fainted as she came off of the trolley, and her mother bent over to help her, and then the crowd attacked, and the mother lay there with a giant hole in her head. And they said that people lived forever after that. Well, one family got across the river. They built a makeshift raft, and we were able to get across the river into St. Louis. And then they said they could just hear the screaming for days across the river. And then they lived for the longest time. Those people that survived had such PTSD from this experience of experiencing this race riot. And what was interesting, I told you that from this point on, but especially in the summer of 1919, there were race riots all over. There was race riots in Chicago, Knoxville, Nashville, Charleston, Omaha, Nebraska, and dozens of other cities. There was, let's see, the riots of 1919 were not the first or last mass lynchings of blacks. There was a huge race riot in 1900 in New Orleans, and these other ones that are talked about in bold here in Georgia in 1906, in Springfield, Illinois in 1908, Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. If you guys have maybe heard people talking about what's called Black Wall Street. And there was an area in Tulsa in Oklahoma that had the people there, the African Americans that lived there, were keeping to themselves basically, but they had achieved a huge amount of success monetarily. And so that area of town was really nice, and they had really good, they had their own economy going on. They were, taking care of these. They were running their own banks. It was called Black Wall Street, so they could pay, bankroll other businesses. Things were going very well there, and that made the white population angry. So when they were given the opportunity to do so, they came in and tore the place down, burned it to the ground, and it was a terrible thing that happened there. There was in 1943 race riot in Michigan, and I read this. I referenced this book in the sources. It's called Urban Racial Violence, written by a man named Joseph Boskin. And I just wanted to read this to you because I think that it's really timely, and I think this is important information to have, so that when we're talking to people and we're trying to help them understand, I think what you can tell them is that nothing that's going on today is new. So he claimed that the riots of the 1900s had the following traits. So tell me if you think any of these sound familiar. Number one, in each of the race riots, with few exceptions, it was white people that sparked the incident by attacking black people. Number two, in the majority of riots, some extraordinary social condition prevailed at the time of the riot, also known as Corona. Pre-war social changes, wartime mobility, post-war adjustment, or economic depression. Number two, the majority of riots occurred in the hot summer months. Number four, rumor played an extremely important role in causing many riots. Rumors of some criminal activity by blacks against whites perpetuated the actions of the white mobs. Number five, the police force, more than any other institution, was invariably involved as a precipitating cause or perpetuating factor in the riots. In almost every one of the riots, the police sided with the attackers, either by actually participating in or by failing to quell the attack. And then in almost every instance, the fighting occurred within the black community. And it says Boskin omitted the following. The mass media, especially newspapers, often published inflammatory articles about black criminals immediately before the riots. Blacks were not only killed, but their homes and businesses were looted. And many who did not flee were left homeless. And the goal of the white rioters, as was true of white lynchers of single victims, was to instill fear and terror into blacks, thereby buttressing white domination. So not all of that is applicable today, but a huge portion of this written in 1976, talking about racial violence that was happening in the early 1900s, is still applicable to us today in 2020. So while that is not something that we say, I don't think personally that it's something that you say, see, but it's something you say, see, if we don't learn from this, this is why this has happened. And if we can't learn from this, this is going to continue to happen. And if you cannot say that this is this is a deep-seated problem in our world, this is going to continue to happen. If you feel that you need to not be made to feel guilty. This is too hard for you. This is going to continue to happen. And there's a process and a pattern. And patterns are the most important thing we can learn to start to understand and to see and to read in the world. And when we clue into the patterns of life, that's when we really can start to learn. Because patterns are truths. They come over and over again. You can rely on them. They won't let you down because they will keep happening. And you have to start to understand them. So I am done for today. And I told you at the beginning that I would harrow up your souls a little bit today. And I really hope I did. An article I read this week was talking to religious leaders, and he's saying that the most important thing we can do is not to necessarily do anything other than start to educate ourselves, and that you will know that you are educated and that you've started to understand the Black experience in America when it starts to really hurt. And when it starts to hurt, that means you're starting to hear and you're starting to learn. And so this is really important work, and I applaud you guys all for doing this. I applaud you for being here. And well, that's all I have to say.
Can I just add something real quick?
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's not really an ad, but you said to do some homework this week, and when I left last week, I was like, wow, I can't imagine, like I didn't know any of those things, any of them. And then I actually had done some research as far as like the curriculum that my school had been using, and not only was it there was like huge gaps in what they were teaching as far as history was going, and then but even more than that was like big, like bold-faced lies of stuff that they were claiming that was happening. And then it's like it took me a lot to like, well, this is what I learned. Like I have such a step back. And I guess my question to you is like, so I've been doing a lot of like just trying to catch myself up to where I don't know, I guess I'm not supposed to be, but like of where my husband is, as far as he was like, oh yeah, all of those were reviews. And I was like, I didn't know any of that at all, any of it. And I've been doing a lot of like Khan Academy videos that they do for like kids and stuff. Would that be considered like a valuable asset and well researched? And videos are really nice to have right about now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would think so. In my philosophy of education, I focus a lot on primary source documents and classic books. So there is a lot that you can read, but also like wanting to just fill in the gaps and like looking at things in a linear fashion and wanting to understand what was happening here and what was happening there. I think it's perfectly acceptable to go to sources like, I don't read Wikipedia, for example, but I would study Khan Academy. When I Google something, I want to look for information. I try to be really judicious and looking for sources that I know are reputable. So I was reading a lot of PBS. I like history.org. There's lots of things that are published through universities that are studied, that are pretty thorough. If I am reading and I find discrepancies in information, then I make sure to clarify that for myself and go back through. So I guess, Amy, I think Khan Academy is a great source. And I think you just have to have a depth and a breadth to it. You got to keep studying and keep diving in. And like, we're looking at lots of really hard things. But there's like really good things. that we can learn about our history as well. So take a break sometimes and allow yourself to read some great stuff as well, and like look at the good things that happened. One of the things that I think is so beautiful to me, and it is a struggle today for that to shine as much as it needs to in the Black community, but during this time period that we're talking about, Black families were strong, and they worked really hard to be strong, and they valued education, and they valued community, and that was their means of survival. And so I love those things. That's really important for me to know that I come from a legacy that thought that family was super important and thought that education was super important. And I like to know about specific people. So like I mentioned, that's why I tried to mention some names to you of people that I look up to or that I have studied about. And that struggle to get their voices heard that Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois had is worth studying. They were both really fascinating people, and you know, they really just wanted the Black race to be forwarded and to do better. So I don't really fault either one of them very much. Anyway, I hope that answers your question or helps you a little bit. Does anybody else have any thoughts or comments before?
I think there's also right now on like Netflix, Amazon Prime, everything, they all have a nice curated selection of movies like documentaries or, you know, historical fiction, but based on good stuff that's all, you know, right there on their front page. You know, they have like the 13th and Just Mercy and Selma, and, you know, even on Amazon Prime stuff that's available for free for everybody. And so I think that's a great resource too. You can just go on there and click some of their selections, and so, you know, I mean, and there they'll tell you, you know, which ones might have a content warning or something that if you don't want to watch in front of your kids. But I know Jenny, I can't remember, somebody else was talking on Facebook this week, and there was a mention of the 13th and how that explained some presidential decisions that kind of affected some other things. And so I think there's a few good resources there to watch.
It wasn't really until the 1960s that there was a huge shift in education in America anyway. And so that idea of like a revision in history and like starting to have some blowback against the way that things are being talked about and maybe changing things a bit wasn't happening. So everything that's pre-1960s, when you look at history, I think it's pretty straight shooting. And then it starts to get a little more confusing in the 60s about what was taught and how to look at it. And like, I stay away from anything that says revisionist to it. I think you just need to tell me what the story was. Let me decide for myself. And I don't need it to be filtered through anybody else's lens. I just need to know the facts. So anyway, anybody else? All right. Well, thank you guys. You guys are all awesome, and take deep breaths and know that you're doing good, and we're getting somewhere. That's important. So I hope you have a great week. Thank you for coming. I'm going to click stop on the recording, and I will let you